Welcome learners. Now we are going to learn about waves of feminism and third world feminism. Feminism is one of the oldest movements in global history. There is no single definition for feminism, but in general, it is important to remember that the various versions of feminism are just one manifestation of the long global history of questioning the gender status quo and advocating for the rights of women to end gender-based discrimination and to bring about gender equality. Sociology, like many of the traditional academic disciplines, is a discipline developed by the white, upper-class, European, presumably heterosexual men. Sociologists like Auguste Comte, Emile Durkheim, Karl Marx and Max Weber developed the foundation of sociological theory as a response to the problems such as industrialization, urbanization and the spread of capitalism. These men assumed that they were describing experiences and concepts that apply to everyone regardless of their gender, race, class position or sexuality. Women like Mary Wollstonecraft, Harriet Martin and later Jane Addams and Jessie Bernard claimed that there were problems in assuming any kind of universal experiences. These women pointed out that in much of the global history, the consideration of gender within sociology was limited and their perspective had influence on sociology and the sociological study of gender. Mainstream sociology remained fairly uncritical about gender until 1970s, and sociologists themselves were oblivious to the importance of gender before the rise of feminism. Across history, cultures and civilization, women asserted their power and asked for equality. Globally, women defined their own interests and goals very differently. For example, women in Kenya organized to fight the effects of colonial governments on their livelihood in 1948, and women in India were involved in working for their own rights along with their country's independence long before it was achieved in 1947. Neither of these groups of women would have described themselves as feminists though. It is clear that this kind of feminist approach in all its forms assumes certain models of what it to be a woman, what the goals of women should be relative to their status and how to go about achieving those goals. Given this history, we should remember that those particular ideologies we label as feminism do not describe the totality of how women think about or organize in their own interests globally. But the feminist model, although it continues to expand and adapt to fit the diverse needs of men and women across the world, is a product of Anglo-European thought. Therefore, it is necessary to know about feminism and women's movements as they developed mainly in the Anglo-European world. Dear learners, the main objective of this module are to understand the meaning of feminism, feminist social movements, that is waves of feminism and third world feminism, and their contribution in the global history to achieve gender equality. Let us explore one by one in detail. The term feminism can be used to describe a political, cultural or economic movement aimed at establishing equal rights and legal protection for women. Feminism involves political and sociological theories and philosophies concerned with issues of gender difference, as well as a movement that advocates gender equality for women and campaigns for women's rights and interests. Although the terms feminism and feminist did not gain widespread use until 1970s. They were already being used in the public parlance much earlier. For instance, Simone de Beauvoir wrote that the first time we see a woman take up her pen in defense of her sex was Christine de Pizan, who wrote Epistle to the God of Love in the 15th century. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa and Modesta di Pozzo di Forzi worked in the 16th century. Mary Lizards de Zornay, Anne Bradstreet and Francois Paulina de Barre wrote during the 17th century. Catherine Hepburn speaks of the feminist movement in the 1942 film Women of the Year. Mira Komaransky is a Russian-born educator in America who produced significant sociological studies in 1930s and 1940s. It is obvious that the F words feminism and feminist have been around longer than we might think. In course of time, feminism became integral to any discussion of gender and especially to a sociological exploration of gender. Feminists generally divide their discussion of feminism as a social movement into three different periods, and these are important to understand to give context to the different feminist approaches. They are called waves. The wave metaphor is the most common explanation for feminist movements. According to Meiji Hum and Rebecca Walker, the history of feminism can be divided into three waves. Dear learners, now let us dwell deeply into the three important waves of feminism. The first wave feminism, the second wave feminism, the third wave feminism. The first feminist wave was in the 19th and early 20th century. The first wave of feminism coincided with the suffrage movements in both Europe and the United States. This is different from the history of women's movements in most of the developing world simply because nearly all of the men and women in these nations were deprived of the right to vote or gone themselves by colonial powers, and so women's suffrage was often connected to suffrage for native peoples more generally. This first phase in the women's movement in the Anglo-European world is specific to the historical context of existing democracies in which male citizens, and in the United States, white male citizen had long ago achieved the right to vote. The early suffragettes were a diverse group in both their backgrounds and their goals, but many of the efforts focused primarily on enfranchisement or getting women the right to vote. Therefore, the first wave in the late 19th century was not first appearance of feminist ideals, but it was the first real political movement for the Western world. In 1972, Mary Wollstonecraft published The Revolutionary Vindication of Rights of Women. In 1848, about 200 women met in a church. They came up with 12 resolutions asking for specific rights such as right to vote. Reproductive rights also became an important issue for early feminists. The first wave movement was successful in gaining the right to vote for women in 1920 in the United States and in 1928 in England, and not until 1944 in France. First wave feminism had fairly a simple goal. They wanted the society to recognize that women are humans, not property. Although there were important links between first wave of feminism and the second wave that developed during the 1960s. Some social movement scholars argue that years in between characterized a period of social movement abeyance. The social movement abeyance is nothing but to keep the core ideas of movement alive and to maintain a small group of activists who can carry the movement into next phase. Social movements turn inward rather than outward during these periods, turning to activities such as small group meetings and consciousness raising rather than to lobbying governments or engaging in large scale protests. When most people in the 21st century think of feminism, their frame of reference is the second wave feminism. Now, dear learners, we are going to see the second wave feminism. The second wave feminism actually began in 1960s in the global north. This movement was part of a larger global social movement cycle that included independence movements in the developing world as well as the civil rights movements in the United States. Here, it is essential to understand the meaning of social movement cycle. A social movement cycle is a period of increasing frequency and intensity in social movement activities that is spread throughout various parts of society and globally across countries. During a social movement cycle, many connections are made between different social movements, with one social movement either directly or indirectly influencing the evolution of very different and geographically distinct movements. For example, In the developing world, women worked within nationalist movements to throw off colonial rule and establish democracies, although they often included women's rights within those larger agendas. These movements were necessarily different because of the historical context of the post-colonial world. The second wave of feminism, like the first wave, was characterized by the diversity of the types of women involved and in the articulation of their goals. This movement was initially concentrated in the United States of America and then spread to other Western countries. While the first wave was largely concerned with the suffragette struggle for the vote, the second wave was focused more on both public and private injustices. Consciousness raising also became an important part of the movement as feminists focused on finding connections between their personal lives and the politics of gender. The feminist author and activist Carol Hanisch coined the slogan, "The personal is political," which became synonymous with the second wave. Second wave feminists saw women's cultural and political inequalities as inextricably linked and encouraged women to understand aspects of their personal lives as deeply politicized and as reflecting sexist power structure. The examination of these connections between the personal and the political brought to limelight the issues such as women's rights in the workplace, including the right to be free from sexual harassment, domestic violence, reproductive rights, and sexual violence. This movement was triggered by the publishing of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystic, a renowned feminist text credited for daring to break social conventions regarding the portrayal of women. Friedan was inspired by Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, first published in Paris in 1949. Friedan highlights the fault of the advertising industry and education system in restricting women to the household and menial tasks that result in a loss of identity and individuality. As a whole, the second wave can be characterized by a general feeling of solidarity among women fighting for equality. While the second wave was a hugely successful movement that comprised many legal and cultural victories leading to greater equality, it had its own shortcomings. At that time, in the United States, the movement against racism was active too. Women of color found themselves to be underrepresented by the feminist movement. Prominent feminists were white, middle-class women who wrote feminist theory centered around their own experiences and troubles, while there were many Black, Latina, Asian and Native American members of the movement. They felt excluded from the narratives and ignored. The agenda of the leading white feminists were often a contrast to theirs. Many women felt that it was unwise to discuss gender equality without taking into consideration racial inequality too. Like the first wave, the second wave contained a great deal of diversity in both ideology and identity. Like all social movements, second wave feminism struggled with maintaining a common purposes in the face of these conflicting experiences and identities. Next, we are going to explore third wave feminism. Third wave feminism was in many ways a response to the contradictions of the second wave feminism. Emerging during the 1980s to 1990s, third wave feminism encompassed a diverse range of theories and orientation among both academicians and social activists. The voices of women of color, who have been a strong influence in all the three waves of feminist movements, were even stronger in the development of third wave feminism. Third wave feminism seeks to challenge or avoid what it deems the second wave's essentialist definitions of femininity, which according to them overemphasize the experience of middle upper class white women. Women such as Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks and Rebecca Walker questioned essentialist tendencies in feminism and are the tendency to assume some universal experience of being a woman. They fought to organize around issues of race and sexual orientation in addition to gender. Third wave feminism was influenced by postmodern, post-colonialism, the work of Michel Foucault and even queer theory. The third wave feminism is characterized in many ways by coming to terms with and being upfront about the many contradictions that always lay beneath the surface of feminism as it developed. For example, post-colonialism influenced feminism in the third wave by drawing attention to the ways in which women had ignored the experience of women outside of the Anglo-European world. This examination raised question about whether women could claim one global movement or whether the interest and the goals of women in the global north and global south were so different and opposed as to make many umbrella movements impossible. Third wave feminism, rather than ignoring or suppressing these type of questions, embraced them as crucial to the next phase of achieving gender equality. Having learnt the three waves of feminism, let us now turn to third world feminism. The term third world refers in general to the poor and the developing nation. Third world feminism suggests that women's activism in the third world does not originate from the ideologies proposed by the first world. Third world feminism takes into consideration the diversified nature of their nations. During much of its history, more feminist movements and theories had leaders who were predominantly middle-class white women from Western Europe and North America. However, at least since Sojourner Truth 1851 speech to American feminists, women of other races had proposed alternative feminisms. This trend accelerated in the 1960s with the civil rights movement in the United States and the collapse of European colonization in Africa, the Caribbean, parts of Latin America and Southeast Asia. Since then, women in former European colonies and third world have proposed post-colonial and third world feminisms. Some post-colonial feminists such as Chandra Talpad Mohanty are critical of Western feminism for being ethnocentric. Black feminists such as Angela Davis and Alice Walker share this view. Indeed, third world feminism became popular in the wave of Chandra Mohanty's powerful critique of white feminist pernicious mischaracterization of the third world women's oppression as merely a worse case of gender oppression. Dear learners, now we are going to understand unique features of third world feminism. Western feminist discourses considered third world women as unenlightened, less powerful, exploited, sexually harassed and illiterate. This belief has disputes since it views women from the third world as unitary and homogeneous, possessing common interest, historical struggles and oppressions. Generally, females from the third world nations have a diverse definition of gender inequality depending on racial, colonial, ethnic and political struggles. Considering intersectionality while analyzing women's issues is a vital tenet of the third world feminist theory. This concept elucidates the identity interlocking hierarchies which classify individuals' experiences. Women's oppression need to be linked with other factors such as race, class and historical background. Social class plays a significant role in determining how women are placed and compared to men in society. Therefore, linking women's oppression with other factors besides sexuality follows the intersectionality concept. Western feminist debates usually use the arithmetic approach to try to prove universalism. Their method establishes an argument that is based on event frequency. For example, Western feminists, by using this method, may postulate that the more women put on veils, the more universal their control and sexual segregations are. In this context, their assumption is invalid, since it does not consider the diverse purposes making women have veils. For instance, most Bangladeshi women usually put on veils to follow the Islamic religion as they perceive themselves as true Islam believers. According to Zabin et al. 2017, some women also wear veils to protect against the Western modernization of clothes and enhance traditional culture and fashion. Therefore, this arithmetic approach is not justifiable way to outshine third world feminism. Thus, Western feminist theories face critics for not reflecting the relation between genders and how is still viewed due to different histories and colonization. Furthermore, Western feminists have been questioned for using the definition of femininity and sexuality as the primary concern when seeking equal rights. Additionally, Western theories do not consider the relationship between women having differences in race, ethnicity, and social class. The failure results in misunderstanding women's nature and their struggles for equality in society. Therefore, it is essential to know that women do not become women because of their sex. Still, there is a need to consider and reflect on complex rationality which plays a significant role in shaping political and social lives. In developing countries, women's struggle for equality is different from Western perspectives. The third world examines equality from intersectionality, ethnicity, social class and gender relations based on colonization. Therefore, the emergence of third world feminism was significant to avoid both misconception and misunderstanding the class as a unitary group. The issues of gender inequality still exist in many societies, which can be resolved worldwide through solving the difference between Western and third world nation perception of gender inequalities. The mutual understanding of concerning theories, historical interest and experiences will bring women together. My dear learners, so far we have learnt the three waves of feminism and the third world feminism. Now it is the time to sum up. All these feminist movements give birth to feminist theories. If we can define feminism in general as an ideology that seeks to combat gender inequality, there are infinite variety of specific ways people have developed to address that central problem. Feminist theory is an extension of feminism into theoretical or philosophical fields. Feminist movements just began to scratch the surface of many feminist thinking. Feminists started to explain the gender inequality in a variety of different ways in the name of socialist feminism, radical feminism, liberal feminism, lesbian feminism, post-colonial feminism, ecofeminism, postmodern feminism, and so on. Feminism, feminist orientation and approaches have altered predominant perspective about both men and women in a variety of disciplines including anthropology, sociology, economics, women's studies, literary criticism, art, history, psychoanalysis and philosophy. Dear learners, given this reality, it is more appropriate to talk about feminisms rather than any one correct version of feminism or way of being feminist, taking into consideration the global scenario. Thank you all.